I don't know if any of you have ever used one of these. Most of you are too old to have gotten it in seminary because this is only about 20 years old. No, not even that. Maybe 10, 15 years old. But if you taught seminary, which doesn't happen as often in Utah as everywhere else in the church, you might be able to get a copy. I understand that they've made them available through Distribution Center, so I think everybody can get this now. You can also download it. It's available online. But what you want to be sure and do is not download the text file, but the PDFs. Because the PDFs have all the pictures and charts. And in this case, when we're looking at Genesis chapter 1, so here we are, Genesis chapter 1 and Moses chapter 2. The thing that's cool about this study guide is that it gives you a synopsis, then it helps you to understand the scriptures by defining difficult terms. Okay? So if you're not a great reader, this would be very helpful for you to get some vocabulary. And then it has some study questions, things for you to think about while you're reading these scriptures. And it has you make a little chart. Now, it doesn't tell you what to do with that chart or how to interpret that chart. Just make the chart. Okay? So that's what we're actually going to do, is make the chart. And let's see, is there anything else here that I forgot to do? Yeah, all of those. But that's okay. That's okay. So, here's the chart. You want to turn your paper so that it's lengthwise, because you're going to be, as opposed to the timeline, which you want to do crosswise, tap more paper. And we're going to divide this into 8 boxes. Now, we used to do this when we were doing math problems in school, and you'd fold the paper and do one problem in each box. Then you're going to number it for the days in the story of the days of creation. 1, 2, 3, and then back up here 4, 5, 6. Okay? So, has everybody done that? If you're not drawing this, you're going to miss the opportunity to actually make it yours. And write down the things that matter to you as you're being taught by the Spirit, something that you might see in the text. Okay. I'm going to have to bring my scriptures over there. That's why I normally teach on the other side. Okay. So, Genesis chapter 1. What we want to look at is what was created on day number 1. Now, this is not a trick question. Each time I ask what was created on day 1 or 2 or 3, just straightforward answers. So as you look at day number 1, what was created on day number 1?
Heaven and the earth.
Okay, heaven and earth. Well, actually,
The light
no.
and the darkness in Genesis.
Do you notice that? Heaven and earth were created before day 1. In fact, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep. Now, the metaphor there is on the surface of the water. So the earth is apparently completely covered in water, and the Spirit of God moves upon the face of the water. Now, the word for spirit in Hebrew is ruach. And ruach means spirit, breath, and wind. So, as it's moving on the face of the waters, the word moved is actually hovered over like a bird. So we're already starting with a metaphor for the Spirit as a bird. Okay? And maybe moving on wind, or wind as coming from God. And where it says that it is without form and void, in Hebrew those are tohu, va, and va is and. That's the sound that you make for and. Tohu va bohu. which is kind of poetic because they rhyme. Doesn't happen often in Hebrew. And it means without form and void or total chaos. Now that's important because we're going to be leaving behind the chaos in this story. What I hope you can see is that before day one, matter already existed. So as the Jews, as rabbis interpret the Old Testament, they do not see God creating the world ex nihilo. Ex nihilo is a Latin phrase used by the Catholics and most other Christians after them, saying that God created the world out of nothing. That before the world existed, there was nothing. That's not what the text says. And so when Joseph Smith comes along and says God took the elements that existed and organized them to make a world on which we would live, that is very Jewish. And what word did I just use for what God did to those elements? Organize. Can you see how that might be the opposite of chaos? Putting things in order. So you might see this as how God's power is going to take things from a chaotic state into an organized state. So watch for that pattern in this story. Okay, now we're at day one. And on day one, what does God create? What does he say first? Let
there be light.
Let there be light. And then, what else? He divides the light from the darkness. Now, on almost every single day, it will use the term divided. And so I draw a line to indicate division. This is long division, it's fractions. That line represents division, 1 divided by 2. Okay? But the word in Hebrew for divide actually means distinguish between. And that word is most commonly used in the book of Leviticus as the priests at the temple are called on to distinguish between that which is clean and that which is unclean, between that which is holy and that which is secular. That's their job, to distinguish between that which belongs in the temple and that which does not. So we're starting to see temple language being used in the creation story. But if you're not reading it in the Hebrew, you'll miss that. So that's why I pointed out. Okay, so he divides the light from the darkness. He calls the light day, and the darkness he calls night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. Now, what that sentence is going to do is set up how Jews measure time. It begins in the evening. Even though he created light first, it now reverses. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. You're seeing that pattern come out in the very first day of creation. First he creates light and then dark, and then he says evening and morning. He reverses it. The suggestion is watch for that pattern. First last, last first. What form of poetry in Hebrew reverses the order of what you've just described? Chiasmus. Exactly. So this is a chiastic day. So we're seeing that form of poetry here in this very first day, if you're looking carefully. So the evening and the morning. So a Jewish day begins at sunset. When the sun drops below the horizon, that's when day begins. Now, that causes all kinds of problems. Because when does our day begin? In the middle of the night. At midnight. We are seldom up to watch the beginning of the day. We're up at about 6 hours into the day when the sun rises. So the problem is, this is the Jewish way of measuring time. And thus in the New Testament, when they tell you what day of the week something happened, we get it wrong. Okay? When they say something happens on Thursday, when does Thursday begin?
Wednesday night.
Wednesday night. So supper on Thursday is actually Wednesday evening. Okay? Good luck with placing the events in the Passion Week of Jesus, because nobody's been able to figure it out. Okay? So my suggestion is, don't argue about it. Because you probably don't know any more than the rest of us do on that. So, but that is going to establish then how you measure a day. It begins at sunset. All right, so that's day number 1, light and dark. And so we get to day number 2. God said, what on day 2?
Let there be firmament.
Let there be a firmament in the midst. So we actually are being told what's doing the dividing. Okay? It's a thing called a firmament. And what is it dividing? Say, somebody a little louder. The waters. It's dividing the waters from the waters. Okay. Well, when did he create the waters? See, it doesn't say he's creating the waters. It says he's dividing them. Well, they were already created. They were here before he even started, right? The deep. Deep is a term for ocean or lake. Deep water. That's the deep. That's waters that already exist. And the breath, wind, spirit is moving on the face of those waters. And now he's going to divide the waters. The term used here for firmament, running out of space, rakia in Hebrew, means something metal hammered out very finely. So you want to picture in your mind something like gold leaf. Very fine metal, very thin, and that's been stretched out to divide between heaven and earth, between the waters and the waters. What does he mean by waters? Okay, he says God made the firmament which divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. So, what does he mean waters above the firmament?
Clouds.
Good. Got clouds and we have water as we think of it. There are billions of gallons of water up in the atmosphere. Now, this is problematic because they're trying to poetically, in a way, did you notice there's poetry in verse 1 with the chiasm? They're trying to kind of set up a view, a world view of what the world looks like. Now, I can assure you this is not believed literally at the time this text is written. The Egyptians, by the time Genesis gets written down and edited, the Egyptians will have already measured the circumference of the earth. They know that it's 24,000 miles around. They know that it is a ball in space. Okay? So anybody who's done any science in the ancient world already knew that. But that's not how they talk about it. Instead, they're going to talk about the heavens, the firmament of heaven. Firm means solid, right? So this Latin word captures the idea behind that being metal. And you will repeatedly hear in the scriptures, the heavens are as brass. How many of you have heard that? The heavens are as brass. What does that mean? Is heaven really made out of brass? So they have this idea that maybe it's an inverted dome, a hemisphere of brass, inverted, and it sits over a plate that is the earth, and it's held up on the backs of the pillars, which are the mountains, the pillars of the earth. And this is one mass of water in which you see a few islands of land. Now, apparently, by the Middle Ages, people had forgotten the science. And so they thought you could sail off the edge of the earth. Unless you were an actual scientist like Columbus, who said, no, it's a round world. We're not falling off any edge anywhere. That was ancient wisdom, ancient teachings. But this metaphor, not reality, this metaphor is going to be used through the whole Old Testament and even into the New. Okay? Name someplace where we talk about the heavens as brass with this dome. Anybody know? Okay, it's going to go all the way up. It's in Jeremiah, it's in Ezekiel, it's in Isaiah, it's in Leviticus. But they will see the stars as being fixed on the surface of that dome. Now, who here does any astronomy or has a telescope? Okay? And can you see why they see it as a dome? Because what happens? The whole thing turns together. The heavens all stick in relation to each other and turn past us. And they don't move around away from each other. You look up in the heavens and you'll see the Little Dipper and the Big Dipper and Cassiopeia and Leo and all of those constellations, and they all stay in place and move. Now, once they started traveling below the equator, they realized it's not a dome, it's an entire sphere that is moving around. Except, of course, we now know it's us that's moving, not all those stars. The problem, and that the sun and the moon move on the surface of that dome, rising in the east, setting in the west. And it's regular. The problem was that they knew that there were some irregularities. Things that didn't stick to the dome, but wandered all over the place. So they named them wanderers or planets. Because the wanderers, the planets, don't stay in the same place. They move around in the heavens. So they saw them as wandering on the interior surface of this dome. Well, if your waters are above the firmament, that means the clouds are up here. Well, that doesn't work because the clouds are down here. Right? So they actually say, well, most of the water's up there. And God will open up windows and pour out blessings through those windows. Right? Malachi. Test me now herewith, and see if I will not open unto you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing. Whenever God speaks of opening the windows of heaven and pouring out blessing, he's talking about rain. Because that is the source of all blessings, physical blessings, is rain. And without rain, you'll lose everything. So this is a metaphoric view of the world. But the scientific reality, everybody understood. I mean, educated people understood that this is not real. This is a poem, a poetic way of describing the world. that God really wasn't opening windows. Yet when you get into the Middle Ages and early Christianity, they have rejected science to the point that they're trying to figure this whole thing out with the harmony of the spheres, and it's almost silly. But you will see this version of the world used through the Old Testament. Okay? And knowing that, you'll be able to interpret some of the scriptures better. What does it mean, opening the windows of heaven? Where are there windows in heaven? Okay? So, the waters above the firmament are the treasure stores of heaven, which is water and snow and ice and hail, sleet, all forms of precipitation God can pour down upon you if you deserve it. Or pour down upon you if you don't in great abundance and flood you off the face of the earth. So, we have the waters divided from the waters. And God called the firmament heaven. So that inverted dome divides heaven from earth. And so we speak of the heavens as we look at the stars at night. And the evening and the morning were the second day. So what happens on the third day? This is in verse 9. Say?
Dry land.
Okay, how do we get dry land? What does God do? Gathers the waters together, and dry land appears. So waters are gathered, and I have them down below simply because water runs downhill. Okay? So we now are moving water, gathering water together so that the land can appear. The land's always been there. It's just been under the water. God's bringing it up out of the water. And if you ever read the book Hawaii by James Michener, you can just picture in your mind how God brings land up out of the water as those volcanoes over the cracks in the earth rise up and form islands. I've actually been not only on the Hawaiian Islands, but in the Atlantic. There's a series of islands that are over another crack in the Atlantic, and that's the Cape Verde Islands. And one of those islands is volcanic now. We went to visit it just about a year and a half ago, and actually went to Fogo and saw the beautiful volcano and the new museum they'd built. It was just a really neat experience as we're driving out to some project. 3 months later, the volcano on Fogo erupted and wiped out every village and the beautiful new park building and everything that we had been to see. But you can see how land is created as it comes up out of the waters when you see those volcanoes. So maybe people had seen the formation of an island as a volcano erupts, and oh, that's how land got here. It comes up out of the water. Okay? Now, this becomes really important. As the waters are gathered together, the Hebrew word for to gather, now why would I care about gather? How do we use the term gather? The gathering of Israel. I mean, one of our major assignments in the last days is to gather Israel. So when you see that word, and especially the first time you see that word in the text, you want to stop and say, okay, what am I going to learn about gathering here? So, the word in Hebrew is kava. Sorry. That's kava is how you spell gather. Doesn't tell you much. But maybe you remember, I think I've mentioned, that one way that you change a verb, and this is to gather, into a noun is you put an M in front of it. So if we put an M in front of kava, you get a Hebrew word, mikvah. Now, has anybody ever heard of a mikvah? Okay, bar mitzvah, it's close. And mikvah has to do with becoming of age.
It's the cleansing. It is the water that they go in.
Exactly. It is the font. A mikveh is a font in which people and objects are ritually immersed in water to become clean in the law of Moses. Every priest is immersed in the mikveh. The high priest goes before the Day of Atonement and immerses himself completely in the mikveh. When you come home from war, you take your weapons of war and you immerse them in a mikveh so that they are, so that you can bring them back inside the city. They were covered in blood from war. They are unclean. They need to be made clean in order to come into the city. The most common use of the mikveh, it would have steps down into it, is that women, after their period each month, go to the mikveh after they have stopped bleeding and immerse themselves completely in the water and come up out of the water, and then they are no longer unclean. The very first time that a woman would go to the mikveh is not at her first period. It is just before she gets married, because you only have to be ritually clean in order to have intercourse. And so she must be made clean in order to be with her husband for the first time. And so the mikveh is associated with the ending of war, with the temple, with marriage, with fertility. Well, how do we gather Israel? We baptize people. We take them to a mikveh and immerse them in the waters. Now, waters, this term is going to be used very interestingly by Isaiah. He will talk about the house of Israel as those who are born of the waters of Judah, or the Jews, I should say, because by then the 10 tribes are gone, and he's only talking to the Jews at the end of the book of Isaiah. And he says, "O ye that are born of the waters of Judah." What does it mean to be born of the waters of Judah? It means to be born out of a Jewish woman's womb, where you as a child have been immersed in the water for 9 months. And then the water breaks, and you come out of the water. You come out with the water, quite literally. And you are literally born of the waters of Judah. If you have not been born to a Jewish woman, you are not Jewish. Even if your dad is Jewish, it's irrelevant. If your mom isn't, you have to convert. So the only way to be a Jew was to be born of the waters of Judah. Now, when you get to the Book of Mormon, and we're reading that portion of Isaiah in 2nd Nephi, it adds a line. It says, "You that are born of the waters of Judah, or come out of the waters of baptism." Because you see, you're being born again. And even if you weren't born in the covenant, you enter into the covenant by being born again of the waters. But it needs to be the waters that belong to the house of Israel, which would be a baptismal font. Now, that sounds really Mormon, right? But it is also Jewish. Because the way that you convert to Judaism is you go to a mikveh. And you are immersed in the mikveh. Now, one of my professors, he and his wife had been unable to have children, so they adopted a little boy from Russia. They were really excited because this kid's ancestry suggested that he would probably be about 6'2". Being Jewish and 6'2" is unusual. They said, this kid is going to be prime meat on the marriage market because he's a tall Jew. And he's going to be taught in Talmud and be able to read and speak Hebrew. This kid is really going to be valuable on the marriage market. So, but in order for him to become Jewish, he was just a Russian orphan. Maybe he had some Jewish in his background. Maybe, don't know. His mother took him into the font. And naked, he was immersed in the water and then brought up out of the water, and thus was born of the waters of Judah. And then would be circumcised because he was a boy. Girls don't need to be circumcised, but girls go through that same ritual of being born of the waters of Judah. So the whole idea that Jews don't understand baptism is false. We don't call it baptism because that's a Greek word that Christians use. They call it immersion, or they call it washings. But it was how you converted to Judaism and entered the covenant, was either you're born in it or you are immersed in the waters of Judah. And that idea of gathering, and that's an Old Testament theme, the gathering of Israel, right? They get scattered and gathered a couple of times in the Old Testament. The gathering of Israel takes place at a mikvah. And that's all in day number 3. If you take the time and look at the words. Okay? Now, there's a dotted line here. That's because we're not done yet. Day 3 is not complete. We've already divided something from something. The dry land has appeared and the waters are there, but we're not done yet. We don't get to evening and morning yet. God saw that it was good. He calls the land earth and the water seas, and he sees that it's good, but then it continues. Let the earth bring forth grass, this is verse 11, herbs yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind. Okay, whose seed is in the fruit. So we have a second set of things created on day 3. Now that we've got dry land, we have grass or herbs which bear seed. And you can just see, like, when grass grows too long in your yard and it puts out seeds, right? And that's true of all grasses like corn and wheat and rye and barley. They all, seeds is important. And then trees which bear fruit. And then God says, and God saw that it was good, and the evening and the morning were the 3rd day. Now, you're probably thinking in your head, this isn't the order at the temple. Maybe you are, I don't know. I hope you understand we're only looking at Genesis and trying to pry out of it what the original editor, what the original author wanted us to see. And one of the most important things about Scripture, and this was a quote I was going to use and skipped. Let's see if I can find it here. Jews are commanded to study Torah and have original ideas every day. See something new. So not memorize what you've always been taught, not parrot back what someone has always taught you, but you should expect to be taught by the Scriptures themselves and see new things, new interpretation, more than one way to interpret a Scripture. And so my suggestion is there's more than one way to look at the days of creation. We know that for a fact because the book of Moses has it different. And the temple has it differently. So, there's not just one way. The story will be told differently at different times. That it becomes really important as you look at Joseph Smith's first vision. Apparently there's people who are upset upon learning that there are 8 or 9 different versions of the first vision. Well, clearly somebody's lying to us because they didn't tell us all 8 or 9. Well, oh, come on. It's been like 30 years since those were published. You could have read those anytime in the last 30 years, and they have now taken bits and pieces of all 9 to retell the story of the first vision at the new Church History Museum. So when you go into the theater in the round to watch the new movie on the first vision, it's going to be like you have never seen it before. My objection to the whole thing is they still have leaves on the trees. And in early March, or even early April, I lived in the Midwest. I've been in Palmyra at that time of year. There's no leaves on the trees yet. Okay, but the leaves are really pretty, so we like to have leaves on the trees. Okay, day number 4. Now we're going to go back up to the top. I hope you're all writing, filling out your chart, right? Okay. And God said, what does he do on day 4? Lights in the firmament. Okay, can you see how the lights are on that firmament? And what lights are on that firmament? Okay, the greater light and the lesser light. So we have the sun to rule the day, and the moon and the stars at night. And these are given for signs, and for seasons, and for days, and for years. Have you thought about those words? Reading them in the Hebrew gives them new meaning. We all know how these are used to measure days. How do you measure a day? From sunset to sunset if you're Jewish. From sunrise to the next sunrise if you're not. Okay? How do we measure years? Right, but how do we use these to measure a year? This is science here. It's the sun, and what is it about the sun that measures a year? It's from the vernal equinox to the next vernal equinox, or autumnal equinox to the next autumnal equinox, which is the day on which you have equal length day and night. That's what equinox means, equal night and day. We just passed the equinox. It was the 22nd of September. So we use the sun to measure the year. Okay? That's called a solar year. And we live in a world where we use the solar year. The Jews don't. Ironically, they use the moon. And they use the moon to measure a month. A month, right? That's what the name is. It's named for the moon because a moon measures out a month in antiquity. And this is within Judaism and Islam today. Their calendars are lunar calendars. And they're measured from what to what? How would you use a moon to measure a month? It's actually from the new moon. When the new moon is first sighted, new moon, at the first sighting of the new moon, the new month begins. Because you'll have a day or so there where there is no moon, okay, where it's dark. But when you first see that little sliver of moon, that establishes the new month. Now there's a problem here. If you have 12 months in a year, how long is a month measured by the moon? About 28 days. And if you have 12 times 28, how much is that? 28 times 12. we're missing something, because how many days in a solar year? We got a problem here. And one of the huge issues in antiquity was, how are you going to measure your years? And the Book of Enoch is in favor of a solar year and is based on a solar year. And the Law of Moses is based on a lunar year. And to rectify the two and make them work together, because here's the problem, and the Muslims still have this problem. They have not yet figured this out. Probably because a lot of them live in places where you really don't do agriculture. Okay? If you're living in Saudi Arabia, it doesn't matter what time of year it is. It's still hot and dry and miserable. Pretty much all the time. Now, in summer it gets up to 130 in the day. And in the winter it might only get up to 90. But you're not worried about your crops so much because there just plain aren't any. And so an agricultural cycle is not real important in Islam. However, in the Jewish calendar, the festivals are connected to the harvest. You have the first fruits in the spring and first fruits in the fall. Because just like in Arizona, you're going to be harvesting in March and April. And then you have other crops from trees and vines that you harvest in the fall. But if that's moving through the year, if you only have 336 days in your year, pretty soon your month for the harvest festival comes along in December. So they throw in an extra month every couple of years. And they make adjustments. But the thing to remember is that all of this is related to worship. Because each of the festivals, read seasons, this is actually the Hebrew word for feasts of the calendar, the Jewish calendar, and you can look up that word in your Bible dictionary and read about the 6 feasts and the 1 fast in the Jewish calendar. They're all determined by being 15 days after the first moon of the first month of the year. That's Passover. 10 days after the first moon of the first month of the year, different first month of the year. They have 4 first months every year. Okay, just saying. 10 days after that first month of the year, at Rosh Hashanah, New Year's in the 7th month. I don't get that. Anyway, that's Yom Kippur. And so you have to be aware of all these moons and months and everything in order to be at the temple on the right days. Signs, my favorite here. Sign is spelled ot. This is an aleph. This is a tav. This is the and. It spells the word ot. That's signs. Otot is the plural. This is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and this is the last. So this is the Hebrew way of saying Alpha and Omega. He is the sign. Okay? And these are to teach us about Him. So we'll come back to that. So in one sentence, we could have spent the entire day just on signs and seasons and days and years. And you can go to the Institute Manual and read the section on the Hebrew calendar and the Jewish festivals and learn all kinds of stuff. And then go online and Google it and you'll, wow. Okay? So, day 4, signs, seasons, days, and years. To rule over the day and the night. And it was good. Verse 20, day 5. What gets created on day 5? Okay, what kind of life? fowls in the air and fishes in the waters. And the fowls are flying in the waters above. Day 6. We get to verse 24. What's created on day 6? Not yet. We need to go in order. You're right, yes. Okay. Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind. Cattle and creeping things. So land animals and creeping things, for me, I associate that with stuff like salamanders and lizards and snakes and insects and etc. Okay? And these are land animals. Okay, there is a second half to the creation on day number 6. Because we get all these creeping things over all the earth. And then in verse 27, God created man. The word there is Adam, because that's the generic word for man, mankind, Adam. God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. So he creates males and females. He does not create men and women. Now, why do I say that? Because the very first reference to people is by gender. Sexuality distinguishes you from the day of creation forward. It's male, zachar, and female, nekeba. So male and female. Okay, now we've done this. Now we've done the assignment from the seminary manual, right? So what? Now you're supposed to look at what you've written down and say, so what? What can I learn from what I have just written down? So what do you see? Do you see any patterns? I see Sister Claire is going like this. What is it that you see, Sister Claire? So they kind of match across this way. Here we have light and dark. Here we have the sun in the light and the moon in the dark. Okay, what happens on day 2 and 5? We had waters separated from waters. And then on day 5, living things placed in the waters and the waters. On day 3, separation of dry land and the rivers and streams and seas. And then land animals and creeping or creepy things. What about this one though? Does this fit the same pattern as the rest of the chart? What's going on here? How is grass and herbs which bear seed like men?
Give up their seed.
Because men have seed. And how are fruit trees like women? Women bear fruit. Okay? Isn't that beautiful? Now, Being able to say something and then say it just a little bit differently, but have it kind of the same, is a form of Hebrew poetry called thought rhyme, or parallelism. Can you see that the second 3 days parallels the order of the first 3 days? Right? If you can memorize day 1, day 2, day 3, light and dark, waters above, waters below, dry land and water, grass and trees, you can replicate 4, 5, 6 without any problem. This is a poem. Okay? This is called synthetic parallelism. Meaning we're going to have synonyms that get repeated. And you've probably noticed that there's a lot of parallelism in Scripture, particularly in Isaiah. Let us go up to the house of the Lord, to the mountain of the Lord. House and mountain, same place. We will, what is that? That's Isaiah chapter 2. There's a lot of this in it. Let's just read that one. I should have it memorized. I should ponderize this, right? Somebody that I know well said, "That's not a word." Well, we kind of all know that. It is now. So relax, it is now. Okay, here we go. It shall come to pass in the last days, chapter 2, verse 2, that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the tops of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills. Mountains and hills. All nations shall flow to it. People shall go and say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob." The mountain is the house. He will teach us his ways. We will walk in his paths. Those are parallels. We will, out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Zion is Jerusalem. It's saying the same thing twice. Now, you can also read that, as McConkie did. Zion's in Missouri and Jerusalem is in Jerusalem, right? And read it a different way, but that certainly is not how a Jew would have read that, or any other Christian, or a Muslim for that matter. They would read it as poetry, and they've said the same thing twice. And this is poetry. They've said the same thing twice. So when we try to use this in creationism to explain the scientific creation of the world, you're misusing the text. We don't normally use poetry in science classes. It's poetry. And if you want to get into the science of the thing, well, good luck. My brother took my son's master's thesis to teach a gospel doctrine class on creation. And he read the opening statement of the master's thesis, which was on chitin numbers and omega numbers, and asked, did anybody in the room understand that statement? Should have brought it for you to hear today. And the reality was, no. Not a soul in the room understood what my son was writing about in mathematical physics. So what makes us think we would understand if God told us how he created the world? I mean, this is a 24-year-old college kid, and we don't understand what he's talking about. We really think we'd understand God if he told us exactly how he created the world? And instead, in kindness, he gives us a poem which we can memorize because it's an oral culture. People don't have their own copies of Scripture, right? We know that from Lehi's story. He had to go and get them. So if you wanted to memorize this text, it's easy to memorize because it's a poem. They might have even set it to music and make it even easier to memorize. And poetry is everywhere in the Old Testament because it's given in an oral culture and it enables people to remember it better. How many of you have ever memorized a poem? How many of you know several hundred poems that have been set to music? See, once you use poetry and then throw music in with it, you then can remember. Now, where would you use music in the Old Testament? It would be at the temple. Where would this poetry have been? The Jews consider this the temple text. Now that's interesting, because if you look at the Old Testament temple, where do you see the creation story in that building? Well, that's exactly the question the rabbis asked. And they wrote down their answers. And in one of Margaret Barker's books, she gives you exactly from the Talmud exactly how they interpreted different parts of the temple as representing each of these 6 days. So the creation story has always been a part of the temple worship. That's interesting. Now, two things I hope we'll take home with us that really matter, and one is, where do we see men connected with grass and seeds? Do we ever see stories about men and planting seeds or crops or harvesting wheat or any of that kind of stuff? Just imagine Jesus sitting at the well in Samaria. He's just given the woman at the well the water, talked about the water. She's run in to tell everybody in town the Messiah is here. And meanwhile, the 12 are coming back to Jesus with some food to eat. And he says, I have enough food. They're very confused. And as the people come out of the city, Jesus says to them, "Behold, the field is white, ready to harvest. Thrust in your sickles." He's just set up the teaching opportunity for the 12 to teach all those Samaritans who are coming to meet the Messiah. What are some of the other parables or stories about seeds? Okay, the parable of the sower, which speaks of doing missionary work, casting forth the seed, and what kinds of ground, people, it lands on. How is that seed accepted or rejected? Right? Again, it's missionary work. If you go back and look over and over and over, these parables about we're going to plant a mustard seed and it's going to grow into this huge church. How does it grow into this massive bush that all the birds of the air can sit in? By sending out missionaries, and they bring in one bird at a time, So this is a lot about missionary work. What about trees that bear fruit? Can you think of some place that we have something about a tree that bears fruit? Okay? We'll see that maybe in chapter 11 of 1 Nephi. Is that right? Yeah. Nephi's wondering about this tree of life. Now, the tree of life is a fruit tree, right? Has fruit growing on it. What kind of fruit that is? Well, good luck. So Nephi's been thinking about this vision his father had of this tree. and the rod, and the building, and the path, and the river, and the fountain of waters, and etc. And he's pondering on these things, probably ponderizing, and he's caught away in the Spirit of the Lord to an exceeding high mountain. Now, if you're caught up onto a mountain, what do you think you're going to be taught about? The temple. And the Spirit said to me, "What desirest thou?" And I said, "I desire to behold the things my father saw." And the Spirit said, "Believest thou that thy father saw the tree?" He doesn't care about, the angel apparently doesn't care about the rest of that vision. He focuses in on the tree. "Blessed art thou, Nephi, because thou believest in the Son of the Most High God." So the tree, or the fruit on the tree, is the Son. "After thou hast beheld the tree which bore the fruit," you'll see a man descending out of heaven. And then you turn the page, and you see the tree again, and you see a virgin in Nazareth, exceeding fair and white. And then I'm carried away in the Spirit, and you see the virgin bearing a child in her arms. The tree has borne fruit. If you read the scriptures carefully, you will see over and over and over trees as the women giving birth to children. How do we get a family tree? Well, women have babies. And they're the fruit on the tree. You all have done that, right? Little apples hanging down on the tree, and you put the names on them, and okay? And yet people say women aren't in the scriptures. Really? Really? If you go to Proverbs chapter 3, you'll see the most obvious connection here. It's speaking of a person named Wisdom, which in Greek is Sophia. And this father is suggesting that his son seek wisdom. Now we think of that, so this is actually, the Proverbs are wisdom literature. It's all advice from a dad to his son, kind of like Polonius to his son. Get wisdom. And with all you're getting, get understanding. Okay? Happy is the man that findeth wisdom and the man that getteth understanding. That's verse 13. Chapter 3 of Proverbs. "For the merchandise of wisdom is better than the merchandise of silver, and the gain thereof than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies. All things thou canst desire are not to be compared with her." That's wisdom. "Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honors. Her ways are the ways of pleasantness. Her paths are the paths of peace." And we just read a verse about ways and paths. It was God's ways and paths at the temple. "She is a tree of life to them that lay hold upon her. Happy is everyone that retaineth her. The Lord, by wisdom," that's the person we're talking about here, "hath founded the earth. By understanding he established the heavens. By his knowledge the depths are broken down, and the clouds drop down their dew." The Jewish tradition is that it was wisdom, somehow a female figure who assists God in the creation of the world. Finding women in the scriptures takes a little time and patience and understanding when they're setting up the metaphors. This is chapter 1. Every one of these days, every metaphor, every object here is going to be used symbolically in the rest of the scriptures. How are we going to use the idea of light? What does that represent in scripture? Who is the light of the world? Jesus. Yeah, that's Jesus. What about water? I am the living water. That's Jesus. Okay, that's the water down here. What about the clouds? What did we say they were a symbol of the presence of? Jehovah or Jesus. He's the clouds. He is our shadow by day and a pillar by night. What about something to do with dry land? Like rocks. The rock. I am the rock. That's Jesus. When you gather the water together and are immersed in the water, in whose similitude are you doing that? That's Jesus. We follow him into the waters of baptism. Okay? Any stories about Jesus as seed or wheat? Good. I am the bread of life, made out of that seed. He will tell the Greeks, it is necessary that this seed fall into the earth and die, that it might bring forth fruit, in speaking of his own resurrection. Death and resurrection, simulated by the planting of seed and bringing forth more fruit. Okay? In what way is the Son like Jesus? Malachi, the Son of Righteousness, will rise with healing in his wings. He comes from the east in his chariot of fire. If you've ever wondered where the Greeks get their imagery, it's straight out of the Old Testament, because it's Jehovah who rides in a chariot of fire drawn by horses across the sky that Apollo copies. What about the moon? How is the moon like Jesus? What does the moon do? It reflects the light of the sun, the Father, to us on the earth. Okay? And is a light to us in the darkness. Now, did you just notice that we use the sun as the S-U-N, as representing both the Son of God and God? That's going to happen all the time, that one symbol has more than one meaning. This is called multivalent. A nice chemistry, physics word. More than one layer of meaning to a symbol. It can mean more than one thing. Find the additional meanings. If you've understood a symbol in only one way in the past, let go of that and look for a new one. Elder Eyring talked about each time he reads the Book of Mormon, he starts with a clean, blank copy. He doesn't want to read the notes from last time. He wants to receive what the Lord is trying to teach him this time. Okay? What about birds? Do we ever see Jesus compare himself to a bird?
How often would I have gathered you?
Exactly. How oft would I have gathered you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you wouldn't come, Judah. Now, the name of that bird in Hebrew, the mother eagle, is Rachemah, which means mercy. That's the name of that bird. It's not a chicken. Okay, it's a mother eagle. What about fish? Jesus ever uses...
Sorry, did you just say it's a mother eagle?
Eagles have important symbolism in Scripture. What about fish? I will give you no sign but the sign of Jonah in the belly of the big fish, as a symbol of his death and resurrection. What about land animals? Any land animals represent Jesus?
The lion.
Okay. The lion. The lamb. Yes, that's one of the creeping things. That's the serpent, right? But we have the lamb, the goat, the bull, the lion, the unicorn. I mean, you can go through a long list of land animals that are used to represent Jesus. So, that brings us to here.
I have to ask you about
Okay.
that. You said unicorn. What are you talking about?
Unicorn is the King James translation of a Hebrew term, wild ox. It does a wild ox. And it's the description, it's the symbol for the tribe of Ephraim, which y'all should know. So when you look at the United Kingdom, it's Israel with Ephraim at the head, and Judah down south with Jews, and you put them together, that's the United Kingdom. So what's this, the coat of arms for England, the United Kingdom? A unicorn and a lion, both rampant, meaning standing on their back legs with their hands like this. If you've ever been to Boston and seen the coat of arms from King George's time on the side of the building where the Boston Massacre occurs, that's the United Kingdom. Do you see? It's all biblical imagery. They see themselves as the inheritors of that tradition, and so they use the metaphors, unicorns and lions, Israel and Judah, Ephraim and Judah. And since basically we're all Ephraim or Joseph, we should learn about our symbols and the horns on those oxen. Who holds up the whole baptismal font at the temple?
Ephraim.
Oxen, Ephraim and Manasseh. One is the ox, the other is the wild ox. Those are the two. So who's the majority of the church? Ephraim and Manasseh. And our job is to get out there and gather using our horns. Go back and read their patriarchal blessings in the book of Genesis. Using our horns, we will bring them, gather Israel. Okay? And we gather them to the temple. So you're not done until you get them in the temple. And when you get to the temple, you find the horns, again, are on the altar. There's the horns. And they represent mercy. If you can get to the temple and grab those horns, they have to give you a trial by jury. Have to listen to the evidence. The horns of the altar, reproducing the horns of Ephraim and Manasseh. What I hope you're getting a sense of here is when you read a story in the Book of Mormon about planting a seed of faith, you want to read that story carefully. It's not only a story of missionary work, which is the men's version of the story, but if you plant that seed, what happens to it? It grows up inside of you and becomes a tree of life that bears fruit. So it's also a female story. Just depends on how you're reading the metaphors. And this creation story, Genesis chapter 1, essentially sets up all the metaphors for all the rest of the scriptures. Now, I hope next time you go to the temple, you'll have something new to think about. And one of the things you're going to notice is it's a different order. Because we're not doing Hebrew poetry anymore. So you might say, what is it we're to learn from that order? Instead of asking which one is correct. Okay? That's seldom the right question. Instead, you might say, what other order could I put these in and find meaning? And when I say the word order, and can you see how we've gone from the chaotic waters that existed down to human beings, the single most ordered creation of God. What is order? Alma chapter 13. Order is priesthood. Priesthood puts things in order and brings order to a system. It is the holy order, right? Priesthood after the order of the Son of God. And we do ordinances and ordain to put things in their proper order. And that's what this story is about. Because it was all done through priesthood power. That's my testimony that the authors and editors of the Old Testament were temple-attending people. If Moses is the editor of the books of Moses, he built a temple and wanted his people to have the temple text with them always. What better way than to put it into a poem that you could memorize? So if you're going to ponderize something, I would recommend chapter 1 of Genesis. And it's not that hard. Some of you have done the proclamation to the world on the family. You certainly can do Genesis chapter 1. But in your memorizing, don't forget the pondering part. And as you ponder and write things down, look back at it and say, what else can I learn? Isn't that what Elder Scott told us? What else is there? Keep coming back, and the Lord will teach you more. And that's my testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.